This is session number 3 of Biblical Archaeology. We are following in the notes, and the PowerPoints follow the class notes in chronological order. So we're looking at archaeological discoveries pre-kingdom era. So Jericho will be our last one in the pre-kingdom era. And then we'll be looking at the next 2 or 3 discoveries we'll be looking at today will be in the kingdom era, time of David and Solomon and Saul, but we'll be looking at things related to King David and King Solomon. So Jericho, lots has taken place in Jericho. Jericho is believed to be one of the oldest ancient civilizations. And so when we think about ancient Jericho of the biblical times, we know that it's near Jericho, that the second census occurred after the wilderness wanderings. So you might recall, well, the book of Numbers begins, it's called Numbers because it begins with a numbering or a census, and it ends with a numbering or a census as they are about to go into the land of promise. And so, as you recall, the rebellion took place after the Exodus, and it led to those who are 20 years old and older. Those over 20 years old died in the wilderness. And now we have a new generation about to cross over the Jordan River to go and attack Jericho first and to take the promised land. And so this is where that numbering takes place near Jericho, that second census, this new generation as they are about to enter into the promised land. It's also, as you know, where the spies were hid by Rahab, recorded in Joshua 4. And of course, it's the city that fell in a miraculous fashion. The walls came tumbling down, as the old song goes, the kids' song goes, right? And then it's Jericho is going to be rebuilt during the reign of King Ahab. So we have, as we're looking at the ancient tell of Jericho, a tell is a mound of dirt with layers of civilizations underneath it. Some tells are just one civilization, like we'll look at one today that's a civilization or time of David that it was abandoned and never another city was built on top of it. But Jericho is one that has many layers of civilizations, many layers of cities. When one is destroyed, another is built upon it, and so on and so forth. So Jericho is one of the oldest cities that we know, and therefore has multiple layers of civilizations. So it's a destructive science. So to get down to the layer that you want to study, you have to carefully dig through other layers and do your best to take good notes and of those layers, because it's never going to look the same once you start excavating. Then there's New Testament Jericho and biblical events that take place in the New Testament Jericho. Jesus healed 2 blind men on his way to Jerusalem, on his way, the Passion Week. They cross over the Jordan River, he and his disciples in Jericho, then they go up to Jerusalem, going west to Jerusalem. So he healed 2 blind men there on his way to Jerusalem. Blind Bartimaeus is one of those mentioned. He also has his interaction with Zacchaeus there. That's in Luke 19:1, records that. And then you might remember the parable of the Good Samaritan. This involves a treacherous journey from Jerusalem to Jericho. And here's a nice graphic that helps you see the hugely different elevation. And you can see why it's could be treacherous, as there are places for robbers to hide in these mountains. And so Jerusalem is much higher elevation, and the Dead Sea Jericho is much closer to the Dead Sea. When my wife and I were in Israel, I don't know, I can't recall the year, but we were before Caroline was born, so over 10 years ago, the last time we need to get back. We were there with 2 other married couples that didn't have children, and it was the largest snowstorm in 22 years in Jerusalem, because Israel doesn't get much snow. But we were stuck in Jerusalem for a couple days because of the unexpected snow. Like Dallas, they don't know what to do with snow when it comes. They don't have all these trucks and plows. So after 2 days of museums, which were great museums, but we've enjoyed all of them, we decided to go down to the Qumran community down by the Dead Sea. Because once we got down the side of Jerusalem towards Jericho, towards the Dead Sea, there's no snow there, right? Because the elevation's so low there. So Jericho is east of Jerusalem, and Jesus and his disciples would have went through Jericho, and he healed those 2 blind men, and on their way up to Jerusalem for the Passion Week, for the last week of Jesus's earthly life. Sir Charles Warren, who was a former British Army officer, he did the first excavations there at Jericho. He first excavated there in 1868 under the auspices of the Palestinian Exploration Fund. But he was only there for that 1 year. The site was abandoned after little was discovered. So he didn't find anything substantial in his short period of time excavating there. But then I want to introduce you to John Garstang, who excavated there for several years, from 1930 to 1936. And his records can be read, and I have read them. He said this in his writings: "How did we find it, and what did it look like?" Speaking of Jericho, at our first visit, no search was necessary in this case. So sometimes it's difficult to find locations. You have a name of a biblical site in the Bible, but you're trying to find, like Sodom and Gomorrah. That's the hard places to find due to the destruction of those cities. Well, he's saying it was not hard to find it. No search was necessary in this case. There's a modern village of much the same name, very similar name, and every villager knew the ancient site. So it was passed down from generation to generation that this site was Jericho. A mile further toward the hills, there's no other site of the required antiquity. Nothing goes far enough back to be a contender for Jericho. This site is not only traditional, what the villagers are saying is the location of Jericho, but it also satisfies all the references in the Bible and other sources. So he's saying it's the tradition of the people who live near there, but it's also what the biblical description of Jericho and its location, it fits all of that as well. So here is Google Earth as far as Jericho, and you can see the dry, arid location, the Qumran community there, when the slope goes down towards the Dead Sea, that's a very dry area, very desert-like, wilderness-like. And so here's a zoomed in, a closer view here. And here is the tell, the mound of dirt that's being excavated and has been excavated by 2 different groups of people after Garstang. It's even currently being excavated. So there's plenty of work to be done. Now, when we think of Jericho, of course, we think Joshua 6:20. Joshua 6:20 says, "So the people shouted, and priests blew the trumpets. And when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat." The minimalists would say that's just a fairy tale, right? That's just a legend, myth. The minimalists, again, are those that do not believe the Bible is historically reliable, and they only accept a minimal amount of content within it. That's also affirmed by extra biblical sources and including archaeology. And so they would look at this and say, well, this is just legend. Right? Sounds like a fairy tale in their minds. Right? Well, the archaeological record reveals that ancient Jericho was surrounded by a massive defensive system, just as the Bible describes. And Logos, or Faith Life, has given me permission to use these pictures for my book, as well as in my videos and PowerPoint. Logos is a great, I'll give a good plug for them, good Bible software, but I'm thankful for them. This is the before and after that they have, several graphics that are helpful as it relates to this is what it looks like now, but they have recreated based upon archaeological drawings, what it might have looked like then, as far as this very fortified city, even 2 levels of walls. And here's another version of the same. So the significance of what they found and what the biblical description gives us is similar. Chapter number 1 there. Archaeological record reveals that ancient Jericho was surrounded by a massive defensive system. But second, the physical remains of ancient Jericho point to a wealthy and significant city as well. This is consistent with the picture we have in the biblical account of a prominent city and one of significance. Third discovery there is relating to collapsed mud brick walls that have been discovered. This is exactly what the Bible describes, the supernatural collapse of Jericho's walls. And here is archaeologist Bryant Wood. I should say there are actually 3 groups of archaeologists that have dug there after Garstang. And this is a conservative evangelical that did excavation work there, who has a high view of Scripture. He would be a maximalist. And he's pointing to the mud brick wall that would have collapsed and still is visible there today. So these walls fell outward, not inward, creating a ramp that allowed the Israelite forces to charge straight ahead, as the biblical text says. Maybe we should go to there. Let's look at Joshua chapter 6. Verse 20. Verse 20, so the people shouted and priests blew the trumpets, and when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. They utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and donkey with the edge of the sword. So the description here is the falling of the walls and then the entrance into the city, going up into the city. And the remains of the mud brick walls, here you can see the red there, seems to be the remains from the excavation there in Jericho, which would allow for them to march right into the city. They don't need to the access to the city is easily taken because of the stairs, as you will. The wall is no longer effective as a defense. Now it's become a way to march into the city itself. And that's what we just read there in Joshua 6, verse 20. When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed, so everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. Now, another biblical detail that lines up nicely is the reference to the burning of the city. There's a thick burn layer up to 3 feet deep. It was found, showing that the city was consumed by an intense fire. Look at verse 24. The Israelites were commanded to burn the city. They burned the city with fire and all that was in it. Only the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. So this is the biblical reference in Joshua 6:24. And here is a burn layer in this picture. You can see that burn layer within the ancient civilizations there on this tell. A 6th point of significance. Jars were discovered, still full of grain, evidence of a rapid conquest, not a long siege, aligning perfectly with the biblical account as well. So I think I mentioned to you, maybe I mentioned to you in the first session. If not, we'll talk about it when we get to Babylon. Babylon had 20-year supply of food and an endless supply of water. The Euphrates River went down the middle of the ancient city of Babylon. So they had the most strongest fortification in the world, and they had an endless supply of food and a 20-year supply of food and endless supply of water. So in those days, you would siege, you would attack a city, and you might just surround it and wait for them to starve or leave the protections of the fortified city. Well, Babylon wouldn't need to leave for 20 years. Right? And so, but here we have a quick attack and destruction of the city. It wasn't a long siege. And so even discovered were many containers of grain still full, because it wasn't a siege. They weren't using that grain as the nation of as the people, the Hebrew people attacked them quickly, and the city fell rapidly. Point 7, the presence of fresh grain points to a springtime destruction during the harvest season, just as Scripture says. So the biblical description is a time of harvest, a time of produce, and so the remains of the fresh grain that had been burned, and here's some of those grain storage jars in the levels of strata as they were excavating this area, and here's a zoomed in version there. Now, a couple of those verses that point to a harvest time is Joshua 2:6, which says, "But she, Rahab, when she's hiding the spies, had brought them, the spies, up to the roof and hidden them in stalks of flax, which she had laid in order on the roof." So this would be drying out these flax from harvest. And then Joshua 3:15 as well, "And when those who carried the ark came into the Jordan, and the feet of the priests carrying the ark were dipped in the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows all its banks all the days of harvest." So again, this points to the harvest time, and the remains discovered there also point to a harvest time. Joshua 5:10, and another verse, "While the sons of Israel camped at Gilgal, they observed the Passover." The Passover would be a feast that took place during harvest time on the evening of the 14th day of the month on the desert plains of Jericho. So all these indicators point to a conquering of Jericho at the time of harvest time. And then point 8, the city wasn't looted. That's what you normally do. That's what people normally do when they attack and conquer another city. They take all the wealth, including food. But God had commanded them not to do that. And so again, we see these grain storage jars, which points to them obeying the command of God. "But as for you, only keep yourselves from the things under the ban," so don't take these things, "so that you do not covet them, and take some of the things under the ban, and make the camp of Israel accursed, and bring trouble on it." So the commands of God were to burn it, not to loot it. So all of that fits very nicely with the biblical account and the archaeological record in Jericho. All right, well, let's look at another faith-affirming finding. Now we're moving from the pre-kingdom era. Now we're in the kingdom era, specifically the United Kingdom. Well, we're referring to House of David. So David as being a real life individual, a historical character. And so we're going to look at the House of David inscription. Let me introduce you to Edward Robinson. Edward Robinson is often called the father of biblical geography because he traveled the lands of the Bible and recorded what he saw as he traveled. He first identified the site known as Tel Dan in 1838. So again, a tel would be the mound of dirt with ancient civilizations under it that's not yet been excavated, that needs to be excavated. And so he discovered the Tell of Dan in 1838. So here's Dan way up in the north in contrast to Jerusalem. So this would be at the furthest point, the furthest point of the kingdom. It'd be above the Sea of Galilee there. It's there, Tell Dan, in that area. This would be near the area where Jesus would have gotten away with his disciples, Caesarea Philippi, in that area. That's when he identified himself to his disciples, and he asked, "Who do you say that I am?" First of all, who do they say that I am? And they say Elijah, some say John the Baptist, some say the prophet. And then Jesus says, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter declares and says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." This is away from the crowds after Jesus has been rejected many times over by entire cities around the Sea of Galilee. They go away. Jesus goes away with his disciples up in the north. The Tel Dan is up there in the north. As it focus on it. Here's an aerial view of the Tell. There's a lot to be excavated. And as you can see in Dan, it's a lot more lush. You can see why they wanted the tribal allotment. The tribe of Dan wanted this area because it's plush. It's got lots of natural springs there. And you saw Jericho, right? It's dirt. But here you've got trees and grass that's grown over the top of the ancient Tell. So the period of time we're looking at the kingdom era. We have Saul, then we have David, and then we have Solomon. And then when Solomon dies, the kingdom divides into two. The 10 northern tribes, highlighted there, known collectively as Israel. The 2 southern tribes, known collectively as Judah. And so 1 Kings 12, 26 to 31 speaks of the city of Dan, which is where the house of David, Stele, is going to be discovered. So that's why we're talking about Dan right now. So let's talk about the Tel Dan, or the city of Dan itself. In 1 Kings 12, verses 26 to 31, it records the Jeroboam setting up places of worship there. In chapter 12, verses 26 to 31, Jeroboam said in his heart, "Now the kingdom will return to the house of David if this people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem." Now, where are they supposed to worship? They're supposed to worship in Jerusalem. But now we have 10 northern tribes separated from the 2 southern tribes, and Jeroboam, king of the northern tribes, is concerned that if they go down to Jerusalem to worship, that, as he goes on to say, if they go down to worship the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will return to Rehoboam, the king of Judah, and they will kill me. So the king, Jeroboam, made 2 golden calves, and he said to them, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem." He cares about them, right? He's making it sound like he cares about them. It's too much. That's right. He's being very political there, isn't he? "It's too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, O Israel, that brought you out of Egypt." He set one up in Bethel and one in Dan. So on this map, you can see Bethel is at the southernmost point of the 10 northern tribes, and Dan would be at the furthest point. And so he's setting up worship of idols. One scholar said it this way, that Tel Dan, and you can go there, there's a bema seat that's been discovered there where they would have worshipped these idols, and even worse, under Ahab and others. So this becomes a very dangerous location, because that's what's going to lead them into being taken into Assyrian captivity. Their rebellion against God and worshiping these idols and not pursuing Yahweh. But it's all Jeroboam introduced that. Well, that's in Dan, the Tel Dan. Avraham Biran made many discoveries there at Tel Dan. He excavated there. In 1976, Biran uncovered a inscription that's often called the God who is at Dan inscription. And so if there was any doubts as to the location of Dan, now we have an inscription that says to the God of Dan. And it's discovered there at this city. So that's a very clear identification of this location as being the ancient city of Dan. The God who is at Dan inscription, here it is. It's a limestone inscription. In Greek there, we've got Dan in capital letters there. It's a limestone inscription. It's 10 inches by 6 inches. So not huge, but this is the first 3 lines there you can see are in Greek, and that 4th line is in Aramaic. The inscription was commissioned by a man named Zoilos. His name is on the inscription, and he is making a vow to the God who was in Dan. So this could be pagan worship in Dan, but Zoilos is making a vow to that God. So that identifies this ancient city of Dan. He was making this vow promise in hopes of being rewarded for this vow. This inscription was discovered near the high places of Jeroboam, the Bema seat, the high place where worship was taking place in the Tel Dan, ancient city of Dan. So the Tel has been identified as Dan. Now let's talk about the House of David inscription that was discovered at Tel Dan. This is the inscription. It was discovered in 1993. That's not that long ago when we think of archaeological discoveries. Biran discovered it, this amazing discovery. He says it this way in his own words, in his own writing. There's a book that the Dallas Theological Seminary library has called Biblical Dan. And it's in it, he writes, the 27 years of excavation at Tel Dan, that's a lot of years of excavation, produced very little written material. So there's remains of the civilization, but very little inscriptions. That is until the 21st of July, 1993, an inscribed basalt stone was found. So this is the basalt stone. He recounts the discovery. So I'm going to read that for you. He's writing this. This is Biran, Avraham Biran. The team's surveyor, Gila Cook, first noticed it. There in the secondary use in a wall. So that inscription was repurposed. Building materials was used as a part of a wall on the east side of the plaza. Beneath an 8th century BCE destruction level, she saw a basalt stone protruding from the ground. As the rays of the afternoon sun glanced off this stone, Gila thought she saw letters on it and called Biran over. When he bent down to look at the stone, he exclaimed, and he's going to use God's name in vain here, I won't repeat it. Okay. We have an inscription. The stone was easily removed, and when turned toward the sun, the letters sprang to life. In their words, it was an unforgettable moment. So the largest portion of the inscription, this is fragment A, the largest portion. This was discovered in 1993 near the ancient Israeli gate. And so that largest portion here is labeled fragment A, discovered in 1993. This is the location of the Israeli gate. You can see that's an area that's been excavated pretty well, but there's a lot more of the Tel that hasn't been excavated. But then the second fragment and the third fragment, fragments B and C, were discovered a year later. The top and bottom fragments, as you can see here, the space here, have yet to be discovered. It's an Aramaic inscription, and it's dated to the 9th century BC, 9th century, so 800s, right? Because we're working our way backwards from 0 BC, from 0 backwards, right? The entire inscription would have been approximately 40 inches high if they could recover the entire inscription, and 22 inches wide. As I mentioned, it's dated to the 9th century BC. Now, this is what was called a victory stele, and a stele is just a monument, an upright monument or inscription like this, and it's a king that brags about their military exploits. And so this is a victory stele that was found at Tel Dan, and it's in Aramaic, and it's on this basalt stone slab. So David would have reigned around the 10th century. This stele was commissioned by Hazael of Aram to brag about his military achievements. And Hazael, or I should say Aram, would be up in the north, and he's going to attack the Tel Dan. He's going to attack Dan. And this victory stele is going to be placed there as a memorial of that. And so on it, Hazael mentions several biblical names: Jehoram, son of Ahab, and Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, who are from the house of David. And that's where we get our inscription. And there's house of David there in Aramaic. And so that's why it's called the house of David inscription, because it's referring to descendants of David. The inscription reads, is translated, "I killed kings," and anything in brackets have to be reconstructed because it's not visible. Either they don't have it, or it's been so affected. It's either in these missing areas or it's not readable. And here's the translation: "I killed kings who harnessed chariots and thousands of horsemen. I killed Jehoram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and killed Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, king of the house of David." Now, we have here, now Ahab is reconstructed. We know, based upon the biblical text and the timeline, that would be who the son of would be. Son of who? Well, the biblical text makes it clear he's the son of Ahab. So we can't actually count that as one of the names that is on the inscription, but it's clear from the reconstruction of history in the biblical account. But it does have enough there for Jehoram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of the house of David. So Philip Davies said it this way, as a minimalist. He said, "I'm not the only scholar who suspects that the figure of King David is about as historical as King Arthur." This is the statement of a minimalist scholar who says David didn't even exist. He's just a mythical figure. Well, I would suggest that the House of David inscription that speaks of descendants of David, if you have descendants of David, a dynasty of David, then it points to the fact that you must have had a David, right? I say it this way: there's arguably no character recorded in the Old Testament more important to the history of the Jewish people and the nation of Israel than King David. You put him up there with with Moses, okay, and Abraham, the big three: Moses, Abraham, and David. Naturally, if it could be proven that David never existed, the reliability and historicity of the entire Bible would be called into question. But if evidence could be found that proves that David existed and ruled at the time and place the Bible mentions, it would support the contention that the Hebrew Bible can be trusted. And that's what we find. The House of David stele silenced the critics, right? This stele, dated over 100 years after David reigned, recognizes that there was a long line of kings who came from the House of David. descendants of David. So the house of David, Stele, affirms a genealogy, a lineage of David himself. Second, the house of David depicts a divided kingdom in the land of Canaan. It mentions the two different kings, king of Israel, king of Judah. At the time of Hazael's rulership, this is just as we find it in the Bible, right? A divided kingdom, not a united kingdom under one king, but under two kings. A third biblical significance, this Stele names two important kings, in addition to the reference to David, house of David. That'd be Jehoram of Israel and Ahaziah of Judah. The inscription indicates that these two kings were contemporaries of each other and contemporaries of Hazael of Aram, just as the Hebrew scriptures indicate. So that's a lot of historical details. Two kings and Aram, Hazael of Aram, at the same time and in their divided kingdom. 2 Kings 8, verses 28 and 29, we read, Ahaziah went with Joram, son of Ahab, to war against Hazael, king of Aram, at Ramoth Gilead. Fourth, the Stele identifies a historical king of the land of Aram by the name of Hazael, just as the Bible states as well. And we looked at that location on the map. It's north of the nation of Israel. I should say, Ahaziah went with Joram, son of Ahab, to war against Hazael, king of Aram, at Ramoth Gilead. This is on display at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. You can look at it there. The House of David inscription. Then the God who's at Dan inscription is on display at another museum in Jerusalem as well. Pretty cool. So that's our House of David inscription. Let's look at another site that relates to David. Again, many minimalist archaeologists and minimalist Bible scholars deny that David ever existed. He's just a mythical character. We're going to look at Kherbet Qeiyafa. Kherbet is an Arabic word for ruins. And so this is a site that we're going to look at, the ruins of Khayafa. Khirbet Qeiyafa is southwest of Jerusalem. You may not be familiar with the name Khirbet Qeiyafa, but you'd be familiar with the location of the Elah Valley. Does anybody remember what happened at the Elah Valley? This is where David met Goliath. That's right. Okay. So here's the Elah Valley, where David and Goliath met, and Khirbet Qeiyafa is up in the hills there, north of the Elah Valley. Remains of an ancient city. It's located on what's a main road from the Philistine area to the west and the hill country of Judah to the east. Here's the Elah Valley. The Khirbet Qeiyafa was being excavated by two different archaeologists, Yosef Garfinkel, Sa'ar Ganor, and they excavated there beginning in 2007. So this is pretty recent discovery as well. It's been, there's been some arguing about this site, an interesting discussion. So what did they discover? So they discovered 2 4-chamber gates. That's very odd. At this time, most cities had only 1 gate. So this is 2 gates on this ancient city. And when we say 4-chambered, that means there were places where soldiers could be in those 4 chambers, as well as military collection of supplies and soldiers as somewhere enemies were to come in and attack the city. So it's more fortified. Here's an overlook of that in the 4 chambers. The remains, the foundation of the remains to four-chambered gate. Here's another view of that. And so there's a western gate and an eastern gate. And so you can see these are the archaeological remains there, and what it would have, a general idea of what it would have looked like. So two four-chambered gates were discovered, which again, this would be very significant because it's a fortified city, not just one gate, but two gates. There's a 25,000 square foot casemate wall all the way around it. And I've highlighted in red the different areas that they've excavated and discovered, the casemate walls. And so a casemate wall is a particular type of wall that you can see it here, where you have two layers, again, for more fortification, for more protection as enemies, if the enemies are trying to get through that. So there was also a storage building for supplies, and then also 1,000 square foot, what they think was a palace and or an administrative building. And we'll describe that here. Garfinkel and Gonor, I say it this way: at the summit of the site, we found a palatial structure, so a palace-type structure that probably served as the central administrative building for this area of the Davidic kingdom. This, along with the rest of the site, disproves the earlier assumption by some scholars that David was simply a local chieftain. He's not really a king, if he exists at all. He's just this chieftain, not a unified empire or kingdom. Was simply a local chieftain who ruled the area around Jerusalem at most. Excavations showed that more than 200,000 tons of stone was required to construct this administrative center. So the point is, this isn't just a little village. This isn't just a chieftain of a nomadic people group or a tribal group. This is a intentional city to protect the kingdom. And here's that the remains of that palatial building he refers to. So Joseph Garfinkel says it this way: this is the first time that archaeologists uncovered a fortified city in Judah from the time of King David. Thus, various suggestions that completely deny the biblical tradition regarding King David and argue that he was a mythological figure or just a leader of a small tribe are now shown to be wrong. This has been reported in multiple news outlets, including the Christian Post on May 8th, 2012. So the significance: one, the remains of unclean animal bones were not discovered there. Why is that important? What's that? Right. So none have been discovered there. So no unclean animals, no pig bones were discovered there, which means it's not a Philistine city. It's not a Canaanite city. They found lots of other animal bones, but they didn't find any unclean bones, which points to people that keep the law and points to a Hebrew city or an Israeli city, not a Philistine city or a Canaanite city. Idols were also not discovered there, which, again, obedience to law, right? Idols are found throughout the Philistine cities and elsewhere. A fortified city was discovered, though, and two gates were discovered, as well as an administrative complex. So what was discovered is significant, and what was not discovered is also very significant. Garfinkel says it this way: over the years, thousands of animal bones were found, including sheep, goats, and cattle, but no pigs. Not even one human or animal figurine was found, so idols. This suggests that the population of Kherbet Qeiyafa observed two biblical bans, one on pork and one on graven images, and thus practiced a different cult. They refer to the Jewish cult, religious practice as cult. So it's not being derogatory. Cult than that of the Canaanites or the Philistines. So this is different than a Canaanite. This is not a Canaanite city, not a Philistine city, but it fits perfectly with the time of David. Here's an pottery shard that has writing on it. And in 2008, this is called the Kheyafa ostracon, which was discovered. And this inscription describes the transition from a group of people led by judges to a nation with a coronated king. That sounds familiar too, right? The time of the judges to the time of a king. There is much debate surrounding the exact translation, but most scholars at least agree that at least the word king or melech is on this ostracon, which may be additional support for this city being a king's palace and administrative center. I'd say it this way. Minimalists who do not regard the Bible as historically reliable suggest that David, if they believe he even existed, was more like a chieftain than a king. They suggest that his kingdom, if you could even call it that, was comprised of a small population, little to no administration, and entailed no fortified cities. These aren't the traces of a myth or a legend, what we find at Khayafa. Kherbet. This isn't legendary figure. They're evidence of a kingdom, David's kingdom, just as the Bible records. So the combined information, the combined evidence of the Khirbet Qeiyafa that we've discussed here and the House of David inscription that we discussed just previous to this proves these minimalists, archaeologists wrong, their theories wrong, and the Hebrew scriptures right. So that's Khirbet Qeiyafa. So we're highlighting 50 of the most important discoveries. There are many other wonderful discoveries. Let's look at one more. Solomon's city gates. So now we're talking about David's son, Solomon. So we looked at Khirbet Qeiyafa that we believe is dated to the right time and points to David's fortified city with two gates, which is abnormal for that time. And they have, 4 chambers. And we're going to look at Solomon's city gates. It's going to have 6 chambers in it. So an upgrade, if you will. So think about the fortification of the kingdom. So we had David, who by military conquering expanded the kingdom greatly from what Saul had. And Solomon's job now is going to be to fortify it. Humanly speaking, we need to protect key passageways, key roadways from enemies. So fortifying the kingdom. Solomon inherited an established kingdom from his father David. David conquered a lot and expanded the kingdom, and so he inherited a good-sized kingdom. But the greatest need, humanly speaking, is now to fortify the nation for protection against surrounding enemies. And that's exactly what we read in 1 Kings 9:15. 1 Kings 9:15. Your biblical text records the building projects of Solomon. Now, this is the account of the forced labor which King Solomon levied to build the house of the Lord. So the temple, it's mentioned here, the building of the temple, his own house, the wall of Jerusalem, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. So we want to focus on these 3 word cities, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. They're mentioned as fortified cities. And is there any remains in these 3 cities to point to Solomon's fortification that's mentioned in this one simple little verse? Hatzor, Gezer, and Megiddo were originally Canaanite cities on or near the International Coastal Highway. And so you can see them on this map here. Gezer there, Megiddo, Hatzor. Different on the western side of the nation of Israel. Now the purple there is the kingdom under Saul. Green is the kingdom under David. So he expanded it a great deal, the kingdom. And then yellow includes the kingdom of Solomon. So Solomon didn't expand the kingdom hugely beyond what David did. David did most of the war, right? That's why God chose not to have David build him a temple, but his son would do that. Right? He was a man of war. So Hatzor, Gezer, and Megiddo were key locations for fortifying the city, protecting it from enemies. They were on strategic locations in the kingdom. Now think of Megiddo. It's one of the oldest battlefields. Many battles took place at Megiddo. The earliest recorded battle occurred here with Pharaoh Thutmose III from Egypt. And this is while Thutmose III, this would be 1469. So think about that. That's 1446 is the Exodus out of Egypt. And so 1469 would have been while they're still in Egypt. So this is an early battle that takes place at Megiddo because it's such an important location. Everybody wants that city, that location. Josiah is also fatally wounded by Pharaoh Necho II there around 609 BC. So I'm just highlighting a few battles that took place. And then in the modern era, of World War II, there was a battle that took place there. That's why this is such an important location. By the way, you think about Israel, right? The 4 plains, and Israel is connecting 3 continents, doesn't it? Africa, Asia, Europe. Right? So if you're an Egyptian pharaoh and you want to conquer Asia, you got to go through Israel. If you're Persian and you want to conquer Europe, you got to go through Israel. If you're Roman and you want to conquer Egypt, you go through Israel, right? There's a picture in Israel. You see it's like a flower, the middle of the flower. You've got 3 petals. The middle is Israel, and the 3 petals are those 3 continents. You can see why Israel, when you look in the book of Daniel and the wars between the Ptolemies down in Egypt and the Seleucids and Antiochus Epiphanes, Israel was just like a ping pong ball between these empires going back and forth, wanting to conquer, and they always go through Israel, right? So Israel was literally the center of the world in the ancient world. And of course, it's going to be the center of the world again one day, isn't it? Yeah. And so good. So the last battle, Megiddo, a future battle will take place there as well. This is Har Megiddo or Armageddon. Har is mountain of Megiddo. And so there's going to be one more major battle that takes place there. All right, so excavations at Megiddo. Let's talk about Megiddo first. From 1925 to 1939, Megiddo was excavated by a team under the auspices of the Oriental Institute of Chicago. They've since changed their names. Maybe that's not politically correct enough to call it Oriental Institute of Chicago. So now it is called the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures, West Asia and North Africa. They've got a lot of great things on display there in Chicago. They made several discoveries relating to the time of King Solomon. So this is Megiddo. It's been excavated substantially. Here's different stables were discovered. Southern stables, northern stables, sounds like military, right? Horses. But then also up here was a gate area. This is going to be a 6-chambered gate. There are 3 significant aspects of ancient Megiddo, which are assigned to the time of Solomon. One is a casemate wall. We saw casemate walls at Khirbet Qeiyafa, right? David's city. The casemate wall, a unique style of double walls for defensive purposes. They also discovered a fortress palace dated to the time of Solomon and a 6-chambered gate. And here are the 2 chambers, 2 chambers, 2 chambers. Again, soldiers could be in these chambers as well as military supplies for protection against enemies trying to come in the city. Yigal-Yadin led additional excavation work at Megiddo in the 1960s on behalf of the Hebrew University. And he too argued convincingly, in my perspective, that the gate was from the time of Solomon. So that's Megiddo. Now let's look at Hatzor. Hatzor, like Megiddo, was a great tactical location for a fortified military city, just as the Bible describes. It's located in Upper Galilee on the primary roadway from Egypt to Mesopotamia. 1 Kings 9:15 again mentions the cities Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. So excavations at Hatzor. So Yigal-Yadin led excavations at Hatzor as well. He held to the Bible being historically reliable and expected to find Solomon's gates there too. And that's what he did. He uncovered buildings from the time of Solomon and a casemate wall, as well as, what do you think? A 6-chambered gate. Yep. And here's the picture of the 6-chambered gate with the 2 towers that would have been in front of it. And look over here, what's this? A casemate wall, right? 2 levels of walls for added protection. How about Gezer? The Hebrew Union College conducted excavations there for 10 years, beginning in 1964. They discovered, what do you think they discovered? Casemate walls and a 6-chambered gate. That's right. So here's over picture of it from an aerial view. And we have the 6 chambers there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And up here, we have casemate walls. So when we look at the basic layout of all 3, we have a lot of similarities here, don't we? So excavations at Gezer, archaeologists have further concluded that the 6-chambered gate at Gezer, along with the casemate walls, were violently destroyed in the mid to late 10th century. Is there any biblical reference to that? Well, it appears to be the work of Shoshank the First, Shishak in the Bible. And 1 Kings 14 and 2 Chronicles 12 speak of Shishak's attack of Gezer. And we'll talk about Shishak maybe next week or the week after, because there's the Shishak relief down in Luxor, down in Egypt. I was there and took pictures of personally and did my video from in front of the Shishak relief. So significance. The archaeological remains at Hatzor, Gezer, and Megiddo affirm their historical reality. So names of places mentioned in the Bible have been uncovered, these 3, just as the Bible repeatedly indicates throughout the scriptures. These cities were located at key locations that brought a military advantage to their possession. That's why Solomon built them there, just as the Bible depicts. Third, the materials used, the architecture utilized, and the final form of the structures, the 6-chambered gates, suggest that they were planned and built by one king using one architect in the 10th century BC. And of course, the king is no other than King Solomon, who set out to do just that, fortify Israel, and to do so, he built fortified cities in Hatzor, Gezer, and Megiddo, 1 Kings 9:15. Fourth, the destruction layer at Gezer, after Solomon's reign, dated to the mid to late 10th century, affirms the conquest of Israel's fortified cities by Shishak. 2 Chronicles 12:4 says Shishak, captured the fortified cities of Judah and came as far as Jerusalem. The archaeological record, once again, affirms the biblical text. Pretty cool? All right. Well, we'll pick up there next week and have some more exciting discoveries. Let's see, what is on the horizon here? We are going to be looking at Shishak relief next, down in Egypt. and that'll be a good one. So look forward to seeing you next week. God bless. You jacked it again.